ModPo has come to Seattle, Washington, and we're at the Modern Language Association conference, and it was a good chance to meet up with Cristanne Miller, Professor Cristanne Miller, and Chris and I and Davy Knittle talked about some Emily Dickinson poems. Well, I'm here with a couple of friends in Seattle, Washington. We've got some Seattle-ish scene behind us of water and fog, perfect, and birds and boats. But just as important, I'm here with Cristanne Miller, who's joined us. Thank you so much, Chris.
Thank you for inviting me.
And Davy Knittle. Hi, Davy.
Hey.
So we're here to talk about a poem by Emily Dickinson, and Chris is going to read two versions of it and explain that, and then we'll get started talking about it.
Great. First, I'm going to read the version that she retained and bound into a fascicle. It has some alternative words on the side, but I'm going to read, as it were, what she wrote first, not the alternatives, and then I'll read the version with the alternatives, which is also what she sent to Susan Dickinson. So, he fumbles at your soul as players at the keys before they drop full music on. He stuns you by degrees, prepares your brittle substance for the ethereal blow, by fainter hammers, further heard, then nearer, then so slow your breath has chance to straighten, your brain to bubble cool, deals one imperial thunderbolt that peels your naked soul. When winds hold forests in their paws, the firmaments are still. Okay, version number 2. He fumbles at your soul as players at the keys before they drop full music on. He stuns you by degrees, prepares your brittle nature for the ethereal blow, by fainter hammers, further heard, then nearer, then so slow your breath has time to straighten, your brain to bubble cool, deals one imperial thunderbolt that scalps your naked soul. When winds hold forests in their paws, the universe is still.
Oh, there's so much we can say about this.
This is such a great poem.
It's such a great poem. Can I ask each of you, just for a start, to say why you think it's such a great poem? I mean, quickly, Chris?
I think it's a great poem because it so powerfully conveys an experience that can be understood in a multitude of ways, so that people can come into it from various angles and feel to the depths of their soul, right, to that naked soul moment, something of what she's talking about.
So you think it's that wide open?
Oh, I think it's very wide open.
Oh, that's good to know. I'm glad of that, because I was going to try to figure out what are the 3 or 4 possibilities, but it sounds like there are 10 or 12.
Well, 3 or 4 are more obvious.
Okay, maybe when we get back to that,
yeah,
after Davy tell us why he thinks it's so great, we'll sort of get that 3 or 4. But Davy, why? I assume you agree. Yeah.
I do agree. And something that I find especially lovely about it is that in its relatively compressed space, it signals to a tremendous array of distance and speed. And that's something that I really associate with the Dickinson poem, and with the kind of Dickinson poems we find exciting in ModPo are poems that use a small amount of space to illustrate an experience of things being very far away and then slightly closer, and the kind of intent listening that you do when you read a poem to be able to detect how far away things are. And the poem really makes a lot of room for that process.
And I think you're saying that as a piece of writing, it also does the slowing down and speeding up, which of course is the great Dickinsonian thing.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah. All right, Chris, let's have a lightning round of going around, the 3 of us, and accumulating 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 possible realms in which this makes sense, or conceits or metaphors or figurations or something.
Yeah.
So what's the first one?
Okay, so first I want to say I teach this poem all the time to undergraduate students as a way to teach poetry, because the question is, who is he, and what's it about? Right. And they want to pin it down. They want to say, he is God. All right, he is death.
Right.
He is poetic
because they were
inspiration.
taught to interpret things that way in school, or because they're just uncomfortable with the openness?
Well, I think both, and they want to know.
Yeah.
But
who wouldn't want to know that?
Yeah, well, right. And then if you say he could be a number of things, then how does that change what the poem is actually about?
Mm-hmm.
So that's the question I ask when I teach it. But yeah, he, most obviously, God, death, you could say poetic inspiration. He could be a kind of master figure, like a rapist in part. I mean, there's that element of being vulnerable and then...
being played like an instrument.
Being played
right?
like an instrument and then penetrated.
And penetrated, okay.
Right?
That's a good start. Dave, you want to add a couple of other scenarios?
Sure, I think another available scenario that I think about here and in many of Dickinson's poems is anxiety or depression is a relationship to neurodivergence or mental illness. That's one of thinking about another speaker as controlling a kind or another person or another self as controlling a kind of variously available relationship to cognitive control.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Is it possible, so that turns out to be very problematic. The experience, the overwhelming experience, the Thunderbolt gets very, very dark and negative. Is there a scenario or two in which we're to think, my gosh, Thunderbolt, wow, good. Is there a way in which the intensity of the final act is a good thing, a productive thing?
Absolutely, and I think that the couplet at the end makes that turn.
Mm-hmm.
So when winds hold forests in their paws, right, there's a kind of animalistic quality, but also gentleness there, holding the universe is still.
Yes.
So this is a moment of, you could say, of epiphany.
Yes.
You could say of total inspiration. You could say of experience so intense that that the only response is stillness in some form.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be devastated stillness.
Yeah.
It could be a different kind.
Yeah.
There's also the possibility of a really literal reading in which we add up nature, thunderbolt, winds, forest, pause, and get climate. That this is a poem that's really about experiencing
so that's a fourth reading.
climatological phenomena.
By the way, it still wouldn't be literal because the conceit of the piano, the instrument, is so strong at the beginning that it really is always going to be figured.
Sure.
But yes, a little more literal. One more thing on the tone. The diction of Thunderbolt, the way Thunderbolt, pretty far back, I think, is a positive. Right? It's about sudden knowledge, revelation.
Yeah, which is one of the things that connects this poem to notions of poetic inspiration, right? That that you are inspired, or epiphany, right? So it's gods or God or some external power that has the force to illuminate.
Chris, does Emily Dickinson use Muse a lot, ever, never?
I'm thinking never.
Never, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I think that's. I mean, you're a Dickinsonian, so you really know. It's been authoritatively said in this conversation that Emily Dickinson doesn't use Muse, but Muse, a male.
I would really have to check to say authoritatively never, but basically
there's 1700
not.
plus.
Yes,
okay, it's not a thing.
Not a thing.
So, but he fumbles at your soul. Now, if that were gendered female. And while Stevens were writing this poem, we would say maybe Muse is a possibility.
Right.
And you said inspiration, which is what made me think of it.
This poem does come close to what you could call her master writings. Right. So the sense of, I think, less an individual, but a force or a kind of person that she has a relationship to that is one of learning. Right, so the master is the figure that can illuminate, and people want to turn that into romantic relationship. I think that's really not where she's going a lot of the time. But this use of this untethered use of the masculine pronoun, I think, often fits into that larger discourse for her. So not exactly Muse, but sort of instructor, power, figure outside her own life,
authoritative mentor. Guide.
Yeah.
Okay, David, I'm turning to you then. So this is a guide, mentor, authority that fumbles. Usually not where you start with an authority. Except God. I mean, Dickinson, if it's God, Dickinson is always talking about fumbling, I think, or that kind of thing. No?
But I'm going to differ from the, because what he does is to sort of, this is like, what does a musician do? The musician sits down at the piano and doodles.
Right.
And she calls it fumbling, which is, you know,
Right.
what
Okay.
a sensual quality. But it's really about, okay, I'm not really ready for full music yet,
Yes.
but I'm letting you know I'm here.
Okay, got
right?
it.
So we're getting ready here. It's a kind of foreplay.
Got it.
And then full music is going to come, which is the equivalent of the
But the
Thunderbolt.
thing is, so foreplay is a second metaphor. The first metaphor is the instrumentation.
Yeah.
And the X, the thing we say could be 4 or 5 things, is the thing we want to talk about if we're doing classical pedagogical interpretation.
Yeah.
So when we get to the third level, we're really far away. Okay, so Davy, can you help us with the conceit, the first conceit, which is the instrumentation? Can you take us through it? Because the best Dickinson poems do it for a while and then they think, I think I'm done with this and we're going to vary it. So can you take us through?
Sure, and I think if we hang out with that conceit of instrumentation as sound, then we
Yes.
get sound all the way through. Then the Thunderbolt becomes part of the sonic logic of playing.
Right.
That thinking about them not necessarily as a shifted conceit, but as a continuous conceit, then we get ethereal blow as being sonic also, and we get still at the end, the universe is still as soundless, as not moving, and I think that's what's so important to me about fumbling is that it's tactile, that it's a procedure, whether we take this as a meta poem about writing as like one of the
Right.
available readings of this and many other Dickinson poems,
Sure.
then we get to think about writing like music, like a spiritual experience, like a sexual experience, as all being
Right.
tactile.
Right.
And it's the relationship between touching and making sound
Yes.
that would follow the conceit all the way through, so that still is both without movement and without sound
that's
at
great.
the end.
Wow.
And you can hear those sounds so beautifully. So he fumbles at your soul, that peels your naked soul. And then in between you get so, slow, blow, right? You get these long O sounds that are really
Cool is part of
bringing
that,
that all together in terms of
Yes.
sound as
Yes.
well. Yeah.
Chris, I am the kind of person, reader, teacher, etc., poetry nut, who goes right to the metapoetic reading. And Dickinson really makes that possible. What if we read it more literally? And it's a poem about the experience of listening to someone perform amazingly a piece of music.
I think that's possible.
If that's the case, what do we get?
So what you hear is a performer,
Right.
and it would probably be a performer in a private situation because concert performers don't come out and fumble first. But in this private,
Some tune up, but not pianists.
yes, exactly right. So you get a kind of prelude, and then you get a piece of music that begins slowly. It begins quietly, and these fainter hammers, right? The hammers of the piano, further heard, then nearer, then so slow, are getting you ready for the point where you
Right.
get
It
the
happens.
climax or the largest sound, and your experience of it is like being hit with a thunderbolt.
Right.
So
Right.
it could very easily be about hearing a piece of music.
Yes, except
Except.
that the second line, by using as suggests that it's a likening,
Yeah,
a conceit.
absolutely.
So it's not about
Yeah.
the performance.
Well, and because the instrument is your soul, not the piano.
And the pronouns, if it were about a performance, the he could be a male performer, but the keys, are the ones that drop the full music on, so yeah.
Really?
No?
As
Or the
players be at the keys before they, yeah.
So as would be in the way that, or like players.
Play- yeah.
But that's still weird because you would never write a piece about an individual performance in which you went to the plural players because there's
Players,
one
yeah.
player, unless it's an orchestra.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know what to do about that.
Okay, but here's what makes it even cooler in terms of performance. So he fumbles, present tense, happens more than once. Who does it happen to? Not me, you. Right?
Yeah, who's you?
Yeah, who's you? You is everybody, right? So this is
She's
an experience
generalizing
that
about the
theoretically we all have.
Yeah.
And we all have it more than once, right? He fumbles at your soul, right? So think
This
about
is
it.
what happens.
This is what happens.
Yes.
It's either multiple or it's a present condition, that the present condition of reading the poem draws you to the attention of what's happening now is he fumbles at your soul.
Well, what if, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, what if what if this is, so back to metapoetic, what if this experience is the experience one might have of a poem such as this very one, and then he is actually Dickinson?
Sure.
So we can talk about the playfulness of pronouns in this poem and generally. Davy.
Totally, and I think that it's, while Dickinson doesn't write about like an experience of Muse, Dickinson endlessly writes about process and endlessly writes about the generative and transformative procedure of reading and or writing.
Right.
And I think that the play of the pronouns also, to me, gets a little bit of play of human and non-human because of these final lines, this final couplet, when winds take forest in the pause. So we keep thinking about something tactile happening, that the fumbling is happening with hands, and we get the sense of that because of players at the keys.
Yeah.
And yet we get not hands ever in this poem, but paws. And I really find myself catching there, thinking both about like a kind of like colloquial homology between human and non-human, of thinking about like, oh, I'm a mammal, more importantly than I'm a human. That like this is perhaps a human experience, but also like maybe a kind of reaching at like a human non-human shared experience of being. I don't know what to do with that, but I really want to use pause as a clue to other available readings.
That's great. That leads me to this next question for Chris. Pause makes me think that the stalking, that a reading of this poem as a kind of slow, careful something, possibly some dark aspect of being, an animalistic being or person, a he. There's the stalking that occurs is the stunning by degrees, and then it's slow, and then pounce, and pause. Pause really pushes that reading.
Yeah, I don't know. Okay, so because you get the verb hold. When winds hold forests in their pause. So first of all, winds don't have pause, but it does take you back to meteorological, climatological events. So this is like when there's a huge storm.
Right.
Winds are holding forests in their paws. You know,
Well,
they have that kind of power.
As it were, pause.
Yeah.
Right?
Because right. So the metaphorical. Then the universe is still. The firmaments are still. Right. So there's that. That's the kind of meta comment on what's happening. But the stalking reading gets complicated by the fact that there are really two agents of action in a way in this poem. So he's fumbling, and he fumbles, stuns you, prepares, deals. But he's doing it so slowly that you have time to get ready. So it's as though you're responding in a way that's opening you to that thunderbolt. So your breath has chance or time to straighten your brain to bubble cool. You're getting ready. And there's a sense of not, those two lines don't give me a sense of threat. They give me a sense of receptiveness.
Scalps versus peels.
Yeah, okay, so scalps.
Scalps is a very problematic word.
Yeah, so it raises the whole Native American business. You know, what does it mean to be scalped? So it makes the external power darker, more threatening. Peels is so metaphorical in relation to a soul that it's hard to know. It doesn't give this, doesn't have the same, it's not as threatening a valence, I guess, I would say.
You have better been fully anesthetized if they're going to peel you.
Well, true.
I mean, scalping, it's going to happen to you, and it's going to be horrible. But peeling, does this relate at all to Emily Dickinson's much too often quoted idea of a great poem taking the top of your head off?
Well, good, yeah. So scalps is taking the top of your head off, although usually you think of it as blowing from the inside and not being removed.
Yeah.
Peels doesn't go there so clearly.
No, it doesn't.
But,
I want to return in a little bit, Chris, to the knowledge that you have as a Dickinson editor about the alternatives. But first, Davy, we've kind of hinted at this, but I think it's time to go back to it. I think of a poem like I Taste the Liquor Never Brewed, where the drunkenness leads us to the straying of conceit. So things get a little out of control, and that's the reeling, we get to 3 levels of, it's really hard to keep up with, which was so magical about that poem. This doesn't quite go as crazily awry, but it does go awry, right? So we have a pretty good fleshed out metaphor of a musical performance, and it's probably a piano because we have the hammers, right?
And the keys.
And the keys. So you're feeling pretty situated there, right? Take us through the possible some quasi-abandonment of that conceit in favor of other realms, please. Because then it ends with pause, which I suppose there are pianos with a little pause at the bottom of there. But, I don't know. Did she have a piano in the house? She must have had a piano.
Oh, yeah.
So maybe
she was a pianist.
Was this a piano with pause at the... Maybe,
Don't remember the clause.
Yeah, clause, not pause.
Yeah, right. Don't remember that.
Okay, but assuming that that's not, how can a poet get away with varying such a really well set up conceit?
Well, I think in part because it becomes about the experience of hearing sound rather than the experience of making music. And where that shifts for me is by fainter hammers further heard than nearer than so slow, that the piano isn't moving. That music being nearer than so further than nearer than so slow is an experience of either sounds sounding louder or softer, or being played loudly or more softly, or an experience of moving closer to or further from a person playing music. So if we're following that conceit, that could be a conceit of like hearing someone elsewhere in the house in an informal context playing music and coming closer and closer to that person.
So you've done a great job, pardon me, you've done a great job of getting us all the way through Imperial. Then Thunderbolt is a secondary metaphor, even though it's consistent with what you're talking about. And then scalping or peeling goes somewhere else. But then we get to the forests and we're way off, right?
Totally. And especially because when winds take forest in the pause, the universe is still. Do winds take forest in their pause by not blowing? Because that's what would make them still.
Well, winds works because if we just shift to a wider sense of instrumentation, there are wind instruments as well as technically pianos are string. But when we get to the forest, when I said that, Chris reacted, and she has something to say.
Okay, because I don't think that this is a poem primarily about instrumentation or sound. That's a major metaphor, but it begins in the second line, right? So really what she's talking about, he fumbles at your soul, prepares your nature, deals a thunderbolt.
Right.
That's the narrative of the poem. And everything else is analogy.
Does analogy
and
work?
Therefore, what what you're really getting at here is a quality of being in the power of some experience that feels like a thunderbolt.
Right.
And then if that's where the poem goes, then it's not so much that it's going awry, is that she's providing multiple metaphors to give you a sense of what that experience is like.
This is really helpful. It's clear that you teach Dickinson masterfully, because I feel I'm being taught. This is really important, in the best sense, I mean. If Dickinson were here, she might say, Al, you dolt. I use these kinds of conceits to explain things that are very difficult to explain, but I'm really talking about the feeling of having your soul fumbled with. So, and I can't do that without metaphor, so relax. Yes?
Yeah, I think that's right.
And of course, if she did that, she'd be doing exactly what the poem is saying is done.
Relax and let that blow happen. Yeah. Just let it happen.
This is really cool.
Oh,
gosh.
Which opens an available reading to those last 2 lines where it's not a deviation, but rather a repetition at a different scale.
That is exactly what I think, Davy.
Say that again.
So, as players at the keys is one metaphor for the fumbling at the soul. That's thinking about, like, on the scale of a piano, like a body in front of an instrument.
Right.
And then thinking about the winds taking force in the pause is a repetition of that same conceit at a much larger scale. That's no longer body and fingers and keys, but winds and forests as keys being played by the winds, repeating rather than pivoting away.
Very nice, thank you. Before we ask Chris to tell us a little bit about the variants, Davy, you said at the beginning when we were accumulating possible realms of knowledge or understanding that this might be about, you talked about neurodifference. You didn't use that word. What did you use?
Neurodivergence is the word that I used.
Neurodivergence. Do that reading. It's really interesting.
Sure. I think that we have been reading this as a poem that's thinking about some kind of intense experience that's both physical but not necessarily perpetuated by a physical interaction. And thinking about physicality that's coming from cognitive experience could lead you to a lot of places. I think one of the places it could lead you is to an experience of neurodivergence or anxiety or depression, and especially because the experience that's being had here is both traceable within the metaphor of the music being played, and also kind of not traceable, that it's not possible to trace back to a point of origin, even as it's possible to identify the way that its effect shifts fainter, further, nearer, slower. And if we're thinking about possible forms of like physical recovery as of a result of cognitive experience, your breath has time to straighten, your brain to bubble cool, to think about when does a cognitive experience turn into something that you're managing with your body. It seems like one way to think about the relationship between physical and cognitive here.
So stillness is at best managing the anxiety. It's not a solution. It's not the eye of the storm revelatory piece. It's not like we're going to cure your anxiety, but what you need to do in life is sort of manage moments like that.
It might also be about its momentary disappearance, about having a physical sensation of a cognitive response that disappears as quickly as it appears.
Which art might do.
Sure, totally.
Yeah,
and that's not necessarily exactly what we were saying at the beginning. Not necessarily positive or negative, but just like clearly intense.
Have you, in your you teach this poem regularly. So have you ever heard the neurodivergent reading?
Never.
And what do you think of it?
I think that it is. I think it's possible. I think it's interesting. I guess I would have to give some more thought to the sense of what feels to be an external power and what feels to be a response from the individual. So to the extent that some of our psychological experiences in fact feel foreign to us, even as they're happening, then you can imagine, and Dickinson often writes about the self as being more than one entity, or as having multiple figures in conflict with each other, or even at war. So that would be, it would certainly be possible, yeah.
I want to invite each of you to, and I'll start, to point out just the idiomatic brilliance of Emily Dickinson's phrase-by-phrase writing, and then I want to turn to Chris and ask about the variants. For me, and I'm glad I'm going first because I didn't want either of you to take this one, the line "before they drop full music on" is so contemporary. Drop on, in terms of music, almost sounds like it's post-phonograph record. It's really very digital. I don't know, there's just something DJ on the radio. Anyway, I really think that she is totally speaking to us in our language somehow in this 19th. I want to know, and maybe Chris actually does know this, but I think ultimately you had to have sort of transported yourself back to the 19th century and listen to the way people spoke as opposed to write. We don't have recordings. But before they dropped full music on, I'm going to guess that people didn't talk that way typically in the 19th century.
I'm going to guess they didn't talk that way.
Wow. That's all I want to say. Davy, you got one?
Yeah, for me, what's catching me is your breath has time to straighten. I think that thinking about breath as directional, about taking a straight breath, is such an interesting and startling image, and to think really about compromised breath as being like multi-directional or like folded or like zigzagging in some way. Yeah. The idea of like the physical act of changing your breath as an object that you straighten out.
The dash really helps us with that. If there were no dash and it were just enjambed, it would be clearly the straightening would be the brain's thinking. But you're allowing the breath to actually get straightened as well as the reading of the brain. Dashes are the best for this.
The dash is the amount of time made available to you in the poem to straighten your own breath.
Gosh, that's good. Chris, a favorite phrase?
It's hard to say. I mean, what a painful choice. So I'm going to pick two.
Yeah.
So what I'm going to say is one of the things that she does brilliantly in this poem is to keep balanced the fact that this is about your soul and the tactility of the experience, so that we're focused on the imperial thunderbolt because it's so dramatic. But in fact, earlier she calls it an ethereal blow, right? So it's ethereal, but it's a thunderbolt. It's a blow, a bolt. I mean, again, we get those O's that are pulling things together, and I love the way that works, especially because the 4 lines in between blow and deals one imperial thunderbolt are a kind of grammatical parenthesis. So he's doing this, he's doing this, he's doing this, you're doing this. And then the thunderbolt comes, which is also ethereal.
Yes. Chris, tell us about the variants, and then I think we want to talk a little more generally about the whole question of there existing these versions, and then we'll wrap up with some final thoughts.
Okay, so Dickinson scholars, at least for the last decade or so, are more and more referring to the words that she writes on the page of a manuscript as alternatives.
She uses a little plus sign sometimes?
Yeah, often a little plus sign. Sometimes she does interlineation. That's usually when she goes back
Does she
to a
cross
poem.
out the word that might be... No.
Sometimes, and when she does that, it seems definitive. But mostly what she does is to add possibilities. So little plus sign, words in the margin, at the bottom of the poem. And then you can tell that she's doing this at the time that she's copying the poem on the page for preservation, because she writes a line underneath the alternatives. So she's giving herself plenty of time, or plenty of space, to write out the alternatives on the manuscript page.
She's preserving alternatives she had thought about when she first wrote the poem. We don't know.
Yeah, I think she's preserving alternatives she's thinking about at least right then.
Okay.
And we don't know whether this is spontaneous or whether these are words she's wanted to keep in motion all the time, or where they come from.
Now, when Theodore Dreiser, to take like a classic example of someone you don't, with all due respect to Dreiser, not someone you think of, or James Fenimore Cooper, we have to figure out that word. Okay, whatever, right?
Yeah.
So editors don't have such a great dilemma, but for Dickinson, this is crucial stuff, right?
Yeah, right. So that, so if I can plug my edition briefly.
Please.
So my edition, Emily Dickinson's poems, as she retains them, is the first edition that actually includes in the printing of the poem what her alternative words are on that page, so that you can look at the poem and actually see that she wrote, prepares your brittle substance, and then there was some little mark, and the alternative is nature. And so you can decide for yourself, I like this one better, I like that one better, or how the relationship between substance and nature, or between chance and time, or between peeling and scalping opens up that
and the editor
concept
doesn't
in some
make
way,
the choice
and the
for
editor
you.
is not making the decision.
And why is that good, other than it's a democratic impulse, but it's something even more important
Well,
for Dickinson?
I think the editor does two things, at least in my case as editor. I tried to do two things. And one is I present the poem as she first writes it. So you get a clean poem. Let's say you are, I don't know, Mrs. McGillicuddy, and you're teaching second grade students, and you want to just give them a poem. You got the poem. But if you want to think about what Dickinson is playing with as she writes out the poem, then you've got the alternative words as well.
Yeah.
And you can, and they're not exactly secondary because she keeps them, but they're not what she first writes out when she's writing down the poem.
Chris, when early editors made choices, and could have known or should have known or maybe did know what alternatives were or what she might have preferred, many possibilities. I don't want to get too in the woods on that. What, and violence is too strong a word perhaps, but what violence has done to what Dickinson wanted us to have when editors make choices, especially for more conventional readings.
Yeah. Okay, so first of all, I have to say that editing is, of course, a historical activity. And every historical period has their own sense of what it means to edit and the best ways to edit. Yeah. And so Higginson and Todd, for example, in 1890, they were presenting the poems in the way that they understood editing at the highest caliber of that activity, and also in a way that would enable them to get published. So if they hadn't, let's say, manipulated the poems to make them a little cleaner and clearer, we wouldn't have them.
So editing is subject to the institutional and political and cultural values of the time?
Absolutely. Imagine
Can you
that.
imagine? So in other words, we have to constantly rethink the way we edit someone's writing. And Dickinson herself is very much affected by this.
Absolutely. So, and it makes me the wholesale condemnations of Mabel Lumestein and Thomas Woodward Dickinson for the work that they do in editing the poems makes me very uncomfortable, because in fact they're doing what they needed to do at that time. Right. So when Johnson and Franklin edit the poems, they both acknowledge in their introductions that there are various versions, and that what they're doing is making choices that are not definitive, but they're making them on particular grounds. So Johnson typically prints in his one volume edition the first version that Dickinson finishes of any poem. Franklin typically publishes the last version that Dickinson finishes of any poem. Mm-hmm. And what I print in my one-volume edition is the version that she keeps. And as she keeps it, right? So with its alternatives on the page. And then I provide notes at the bottom of the page letting you know if she sends the poem to anybody else. And if she does, who she sends it to, and whether the version is variant that she sends. Mm-hmm. So that you immediately have information not just about what you could call a kind of core poem, but about what else she's doing with it.
Right.
But the other thing is that Dickinson provides, she writes no alternatives at all for the majority of the poems. So the majority of the poems are actually what we could call resolved.
Right.
And people want to believe that everything is marked up and alternative or variant. And
thank you for explaining that. We have learned, all of us, I mean, that poets, and not just scholars, editors, and critics, poets are really, they see a lot at stake here. To take the most obvious example, Susan Howe, who, goes to the Houghton, wants to see the poems she's writing about as they were written, believes in the handwriting and all that stuff. So I turned to Davy for a thought on this, because it seems to me that so many of the poems that we talk about by Dickinson and almost anticipate that as an issue and a problem, and they become meta-poetic in the sense that they say, here it is, I don't know entirely what it's about, what are you going to do? There's fumbling all over the place. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Your thoughts on that?
Something that's amazing, Chris, about the way you're describing your process of putting your edition together is that it establishes a relationship between poet and critic, or poet and scholar, or frequently non-institutionally oriented person and institutionally oriented person, that is an exchange of power outside the paradigm of institutionality. And what I mean by that is that something that we're trying to do with ModPo poems very frequently is to think about, all right, let's think about what it would mean to have co-constitutive meaning between readers, but also between poet as an expert and critic as a different kind of expert, and to think about two different ways of being with language coming together in the process of creating the poem as it's read, the poem, the thing we're talking about in the room, rather than the poem on the page. Yeah. And that proliferation of versions, something that you see later in the course with the language poets thinking about this thing that was read aloud, is it the same thing that's on the page? How do we talk about them as being separate and important and connected all at the same time? Right. Is the same conversation that we're having about the Dickinson poems. Here are these different iterations, and they're all the poem, and the work that we do in figuring them out together is the work that's valuable. And something that's cool about this conversation starting with Dickinson is that it provides a model for how the process of creating the poem itself dictates the kind of expertise and power relationships had in conversations around it.
There's another thing that you could say about poets and contemporary poets and Dickinson, especially Dickinson's manuscripts, is that the focus tends to be on individual pages, a single poem on a manuscript page. And another thing that I do in my edition that I hope broadens that conversation is to present the poems that she bound into fascicles in their fascicle order. So it's the only place that you can go and actually read the poems in the order that she copied them onto individual sheets of paper and then bound them into fascicles. So you can read all 40 fascicles all the way through
Right.
as she presented them. And I think that also provides a different way into thinking about what matters in the poems. I think there's enormous enthusiasm for going straight to the handwriting, right? Or going straight to the visuality of the page. But there are other ways to think about pages. Yeah.
At the same time, this has, what you've just described, has led to an opening out of the poetic media, to the point where someone like Jen Bervin is almost more interested in the fascicle-like, sewing-like materiality and producing poetic work, Jen, that is coming out of that as much as the experience of the visual on the page. We could, if there were 1,700 plus poems, and not all of them bear quite the scrutiny that this does, a lot of them do though, we'd have an hour each, that'd be 1,700 plus hours, that would be one heck of a series of videos, and the person who is holding the sound, what do we call that, a boom mic, is whose like hands are falling off after 1,700 hours would be in trouble. So, what we like to do is try to wrap up, pretend to wrap up something like this with some final thoughts. So, who wants to go first? Something you wanted to say, Chris, as you were on the plane from the East, coming here, that you didn't have a chance to yet.
I guess this goes back to a question you asked Davy that maybe is important to thinking about this poem. Dickinson rarely writes about the activity of the poet in writing. What she more often writes about is the effect of reading a poem, so that she more often presents herself in the position of reader or hearer, right? What would the dower be had I something to stun myself with bolts of melody, right? So reading a poem is like being stunned with bolts of melody. A metaphor very similar to what she's using here. And so I tend not to think about this as Dickinson as poet, right? If that first pronoun was she rather than he, but perhaps, Dickinson reading some other poem, or again, as we've talked about, more metaphysical notions of inspiration or epiphany that could open up. But I love this poem because it seems to me so much about power, so much about learning, so much about the ways that you cannot divorce the tactile from the oral, from the experiential, from the soul, and she pulls it together beautifully. It's a great poem to read out loud.
It really is, and you read it so beautifully, and also this is a moment where I can thank you for pointing us to this poem, which we just, sorry for the use of the word we, but the people who hang out with me and talk about Dickinson, this is new to us.
Well, I love it.
Yeah. Davy, final thought?
I want to spend a minute thinking about the word imperial, and thinking about imperial and the version of the poem that includes the word scalps. I think that there is a version of reading, a way of thinking about this poem that we didn't consider, that's thinking about the legacies of living with settler colonialism and living on land that is part of a settler colonial legacy. And it wouldn't, because Dickinson thinks so much about power and so much about the specific situated natural environment around her, and because there's so much interesting and complex gendered language and gendered pronouns in her poems, that feels like a reading that's available, of thinking about within the different ways that power inheres in her life as a person living with language and as reader, a person grappling with forming a relationship to land available to her because of its claiming as part of a settler colonialist legacy, feels like something she might have been thinking about.
And certainly something that Susan Howe, in her book by Emily Dickinson, I don't think she talks about this poem, wants us to think about. It's almost as if Susan Howe wants Emily Dickinson to begin to have a little note in every poem, the way here in this part of the world, people, especially north of us in Canada, they begin every activity by remarking that we are doing this activity on the unceded territory of First Peoples. And it's possible to read this as building in to imperial, to scalp, and also those forests.
Yes,
Sure.
exactly.
Right?
Gardens and
It's saying, you know,
forests,
we're having this aesthetic experience, but it's not just the aesthetic experience of a European sonata that's being played perfectly by a great performer, but you know, there's a wider view of performance and sound that we need to take into account. That's a friendly reading of that. And my final thought actually follows from that, which is that this is a sonnet. And talk about importing something. Now, of course, it's a Dickinsonian sonnet, so like it takes you a half hour to even realize there are 14 lines and it has a couplet at the end. But and as such, it just makes me even more excited about the powerful radicalism of saying, well, you know, I'm writing a sonnet. You won't notice it, but it's really going to take all those arcane and constraining rules of a sonnet. I'm going to blow them around and fool around and start with a little etude and warm up. And you know, she's kind of doing to the sonnet what this performer is doing to music and to our experience. Thank you both so much. This has been so fun.
It has.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So.